Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. The silence of the kitchen stretched thin, interrupted only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional flicker of the dim lamp overhead. Anthony stood at the center, posture rigid yet deceptively calm, his fingers tracing the cold ceramic of the coffee cup left abandoned on the table. A thin crack marred its surface, a quiet reminder of fractures hidden beneath glossy veneers. He glanced up, eyes fixed on Mia, who stood across from him, her expression a mask of composed disarray, dark eyes glistening under the wavering light. In his hand, Anthony held her phone, the screen glowing like a tiny lighthouse in the half-dark. His thumb hovered over the recent call log, his best friend's name, Sam, glaring back at him in digital ink. The timestamp read 1:32 a.m. Not once, not twice, but more than any friend should call at that hour. A faint muscle twitched at his jaw, and the unspoken tension curled around them like a serpent tightening its coils. Mia's voice, soft and defensive, tried to breach the silence. "Anthony, I can explain." He lifted his free hand, silencing her. There was no room for excuses tonight. The weight of knowing, the realization that pieces of his life had shifted beneath his feet without warning, stilled the air between them. His eyes, normally warm with patience, glinted coldly. The calm before a storm. "I already know, Mia," the words dropped like stones into a deep, unfathomable well. His gaze sharpened, unwavering. "But I thought it best to hear it with both of you here." The front doorbell chimed, a sound that suddenly seemed to vibrate against the tension, announcing the arrival that would unravel their quiet, fractured world. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the hint of a chill. Life as they knew it balanced on the cusp of upheaval, as the shadow of betrayal prepared to cross their threshold. Anthony moved to the side as Mia's gaze shifted to the hallway, where the sound of footsteps grew louder. The creak of the old wooden floorboards sent a tremor through the house, each step signaling Sam's approach. The night air that slipped in as the front door closed behind him carried a biting edge, mingling with the simmering tension already thick in the room. Sam stood framed by the doorway, his confident expression momentarily faltering as he took in the scene. Anthony's composed yet rigid stance, the accusatory glow of the phone in his hand, and Mia, whose fingers had curled into tight fists at her sides. He blinked once, twice, as if recalibrating, searching for the playful banter or the easy laughter that once filled these rooms. But tonight was different. The silence wasn't comfortable, it was waiting. "Well, this is unexpected," Sam said, a dry chuckle that fell flat against the quiet. He took a step into the kitchen, the dim light catching the sharp angles of his face and casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The calm confidence that usually defined him seemed to fray at the edges as he caught Anthony's unyielding gaze. Anthony didn't reply immediately. His eyes bored into Sam's, searching for any sign of remorse or hesitation, anything that would betray the truth beneath the practiced mask. When he spoke, his voice was as smooth as polished steel. "Unexpected. No, Sam, I think you knew this moment would come. Just maybe not tonight." Mia shifted, the rustle of fabric against the silence drawing both men's eyes. She swallowed hard, her throat constricting around words she couldn't find. The kitchen, once a haven of warmth and shared moments, felt like a stage where betrayal had been rehearsed too many times, and now the final act was upon them. Sam's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Anthony, whatever you think." Anthony's raised eyebrow cut him off. "Spare me, Sam. I didn't invite you here for explanations." He tossed the phone onto the table with a casual flick, the sound echoing louder than it should. "I'm here for the truth. Between all of us." The seconds dragged, each heartbeat like a drumbeat marking the passage of unspoken thoughts. Mia's eyes darted between them, a trapped animal searching for an exit in the cage of her own making. Anthony felt a pang of something. Was it anger? Loss? Curled tighter in his chest, but he stood unmoved, waiting. "You know, Anthony," Sam's voice was low, measured, sometimes knowing everything isn't as satisfying as you think. The flickering light above cast his face in half shadows, but his eyes, usually so full of jest, now reflected a glint of something darker. Mia flinched, the words lodging themselves in the small space between defiance and shame. Anthony exhaled slowly, a smile without warmth tugging at his lips. "That's where you're wrong, Sam. Tonight, we're going to find out just how satisfying it is." The finality in Anthony's voice settled over them, heavy and unyielding. The confrontation that would reshape everything hovered just a breath away, and in that moment, the silence was more deafening than the words yet to be spoken. The air between the three of them grew colder as the silence stretched, an invisible fourth presence in the room. Anthony's eyes, steely and determined, flicked between Sam and Mia, The weight of unspoken truths pressed on them like a storm waiting to break. Outside, a branch scraped against the window, its fingers clawing at the glass with a restless urgency. Mia's breath quickened, and her pulse thrummed loudly in her ears. She could feel her composure cracking, like ice over a deep lake ready to shatter under pressure. Her mind raced, grasping for words that could piece together an explanation, a defense, but everything seemed inadequate under Anthony's unyielding stare. She dared not look at Sam, whose presence now felt intrusive, an unwelcome reminder of choices made in the shadows. Sam shifted his weight, the creak of the floor punctuating the silence like an accusation. He kept his eyes on Anthony, sensing that any sign of guilt or weakness could tip the balance into chaos. The tension was suffocating, yet he refused to be the first to break. In the years they'd known each other, he had seen Anthony's anger only a few times, always controlled, simmering beneath a surface of calm. But this was different. This was personal. Anthony took a step forward, slow and deliberate. The kitchen light threw his shadow long and thin across the room, almost merging with Sam's at the edge. "Mia," he said, the single word hanging heavy in the air, demanding her attention. She met his gaze, eyes wide, almost pleading. "Why?" His voice wasn't raised, but the weight behind it was undeniable. He didn't want an excuse, didn't want to hear the rehearsed lines or the shallow justifications. He wanted the raw truth, stripped of any pretense. Mia opened her mouth, but only a whisper came out, trembling and fragile. "I didn't mean for it to." Anthony's eyes narrowed, cutting off her words. "Don't," he said softly, but the edge was sharp enough to wound. He turned to Sam, who stood like a statue carved from guilt and defiance. "And you, best friends, right? Isn't that what we called ourselves?" A flicker of something crossed Sam's face, regret, perhaps, or resignation. "It's not that simple, Anthony." A bitter laugh escaped Anthony's lips. "Of course it is. It always is until someone decides to cross that line." He glanced at the cracked coffee cup on the table, the small fracture a stark metaphor for the irreparable split between them. His fingers brushed the rim, and he let it go, the tension in the room shifting with the slight movement. Mia stepped forward, her voice steadier now but still shadowed with uncertainty. "Anthony, I never wanted to hurt you. And yet, here we are." His voice was calm, controlled, but the storm behind it threatened to spill over at any moment. He turned his attention fully on Sam, whose jaw clenched as he met Anthony's gaze. There were no words left to buffer the moment, only the truth waiting to be bared, cold and uncompromising. For the first time, the weight of reality pressed down on all of them, making it clear that whatever came next would change everything they had once known. The silence broke with the sharp ring of the clock striking midnight, each chime a reminder that time was no longer on their side. Anthony's eyes flicked the hallway mirror, catching a glimpse of his reflection, a man he barely recognized, stripped of certainty and safety. He drew in a breath, deep and deliberate, as if steadying himself before a plunge. The air felt heavier, thick with unsaid confessions. Mia's heartbeat drummed erratically, each thud a hammer against her ribs. She knew there was no going back, no erasing the choices that had led them here. Anthony's steady presence, which had once been a source of comfort, now felt like an unyielding force pressing for the truth. She looked to Sam, the man who once seemed an escape from her secrets, now just another part of the trap closing in around her. Sam shifted, the faint scrape of his shoe against the floor amplifying the tension. He broke the stare with Anthony, glancing at Mia with an unreadable expression. Guilt? Fear? Something more elusive? The room, though still, pulsed with the weight of what hadn't been said. "I made a mistake," Mia finally said, her voice quiet but gaining strength as she spoke. "But it wasn't meant to destroy us." The admission, though simple, carried the weight of every lie, every stolen glance, every hushed conversation. Anthony's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened into a mask of relentless focus. "Destroy us," he repeated, voice low. "Mia, it's not the act alone, it's the lie that follows it, the way it festers." His eyes darted to Sam, who flinched almost imperceptibly. "And it's the people you trust who twist the knife." Sam exhaled, a sound heavy with the strain of words he wished he could swallow. "Anthony, you need to understand." "No," Anthony interrupted, his voice calm but final. "I don't need to understand anything except how far this has gone and why." He let the question hang, his gaze locked on Sam as if daring him to answer. Sam's defiance faltered. The man who always carried himself with an effortless confidence now stood rooted, stripped of pretense. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," he admitted. "It just happened." Mia turned to Anthony, her face painted with regret. "I was lonely, Anthony. You were always so consumed with work, with everything except us." The words felt hollow even to her as they left her lips, but they were the only defense she could summon. Anthony's eyes darkened, the hint of betrayal morphing into something deeper, more bitter. Work? You think this was about work? His laugh was devoid of humor, an echo of disbelief. He leaned against the table, the crack in the coffee cup beneath his fingertips, a sharp reminder of the fragile state of their marriage. Do you really believe that's enough reason to destroy everything we built? Sam took a step forward, his voice low but clear. I think we all know it's too late for excuses. The admission hung heavy in the air, a confession that was equal parts acceptance and defeat. Anthony pushed away from the table, his movements deliberate. Then let's stop pretending, he said, a cold finality settling over his words. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of what was to come pressed down on them, leaving no room for comfort, only the hard edges of truth. Anthony's hand trembled as he let go of the cracked coffee cup, a small sign of the emotion he kept fiercely bottled inside. The flickering light above them cast shadows that danced and shifted across their faces, as if the room itself was alive with anticipation. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt both oppressive and fragile, as though a single word could shatter it into a million sharp pieces. Mia's eyes glistened as she took a hesitant step forward. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse, strained by the weight of everything left unsaid. Anthony, please. He raised a hand, palm outward, halting her words. His gaze, sharp and relentless, remained fixed on Sam, who had yet to move from his spot near the threshold. Anthony's stare was like a searchlight, probing for cracks in Sam's carefully held composure. Tell me, Anthony said, his voice barely more than a whisper but suffused with command. Was it worth it? Sam exhaled, his shoulders slumping, as if the question had drained the last of his strength. He looked at Mia briefly, then returned his focus to Anthony. Nothing about this was ever simple. You know that. A scoff escaped Anthony's lips, raw and bitter. Simple. Betrayal is straightforward, Sam. It's the reasons that are tangled. His voice tightened, and he swallowed hard, fighting the urge to let rage overpower reason. Was it the thrill, the risk, or just a way to feel something different? Mia flinched at his words, the blunt edges of truth slicing through her carefully maintained defenses. It wasn't supposed to be anything at all, she said, her voice cracking. It just spiraled. Spiraled? The sarcasm in Anthony's tone was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. He turned to her now, his expression weary yet fierce. Do you even hear yourself, Mia? It just happened isn't an answer. It's an excuse. Sam shifted again, his eyes finally softening with something akin to remorse. Anthony, for what it's worth, it wasn't about hurting you. It was a moment that went too far, then another, and before we knew it, there was no turning back. Anthony's jaw clenched, the muscles beneath his skin taut as cables. He took a breath, deep and ragged, and let it out slowly. The room seemed to contract around them, walls pressing inward with the suffocating weight of revelation. He spoke again, but this time his voice carried a note of exhaustion, as though the fight had drained him more than he cared to admit. I trusted you both. You were my world, and you turned it into something unrecognizable. A brittle silence followed, each of them standing like statues, locked in the moment. The kitchen, once a space of shared meals and quiet laughter, felt like a theater set for tragedy. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the room, a reminder that the world beyond their shattered reality continued, indifferent. Finally, Sam nodded, a small, almost defeated gesture. You're right, he said, eyes downcast, and I can't change what's done. But you deserve better than lies. Anthony's gaze softened just a fraction, a glimmer of something shifting beneath the surface. He looked at Mia, then back at Sam, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of things ending, and the slow, painful realization of what came next. Anthony straightened, the quiet strength in his posture a final barrier against collapse. The cracks in his resolve were there, small fissures threatening to widen, but he held them together with sheer will. Across the room, Mia's eyes pleaded for understanding, even as guilt anchored her in place. Sam stood apart, the air around him heavy with remorse that no words could relieve. The minutes ticked by, the silence between them no longer merely tense but aching, filled with the ghosts of what could have been said before it came to this. Anthony's mind churned, sifting through memories now tainted by what he knew. The shared holidays, the quiet late-night talks, even the mundane routines, they all seemed far away, unreachable as if belonging to another life. Finally, he broke the stillness, his voice low, edged with a sadness deeper than anger. How long? The question wasn't directed at either one specifically, but it cut through the room with the precision of a scalpel. Mia swallowed, her gaze flicking to Sam and back to Anthony. Months, she whispered, the words slipping out like a confession she couldn't hold in any longer. It started as just talking. Anthony closed his eyes for a brief moment, the implication pulling taut lines of strain across his face. He turned to Sam, waiting. The man who had once been his confidant, the one he trusted implicitly, now looked back with eyes shadowed by regret. It was never supposed to become this, Sam said, the familiar confidence in his voice stripped away. I know it sounds hollow now, but I tried to stop it. The bitter irony didn't escape Anthony, and a humorless smile twitched at the corner of his mouth. And yet, here we are, he said, each word deliberate. No one tried hard enough. The room felt colder, the dim light emphasizing the distance between them. Mia moved slightly, reaching out instinctively, but Anthony took a step back, the gesture halting her in place. His eyes softened for just a moment as they met hers, a flicker of something old and deep, now almost lost. Did it mean anything? He asked, the question raw, stripped of pretense. It was less about jealousy and more about needing to understand where he stood in the wreckage. Mia's lip quivered, but she held his gaze. I thought it did, for a time, she admitted, voice cracking under the weight of the moment. But it wasn't real, Anthony, not the way we were. The correction felt like a final blow, small but decisive. Anthony nodded slowly, absorbing the words, letting them settle. The anger he'd felt earlier seemed to dissolve, replaced by an ache he hadn't anticipated, a sense of something slipping away. Irreversible. He turned to Sam, who looked ready to speak but stopped at the sight of Anthony's expression. There was no more room for explanations. You need to leave, Anthony said, the command quiet but unarguable. Sam's eyes darted to Mia, a fleeting glance filled with the echoes of a connection now severed. Without a word, he nodded and walked out, the sound of the front door closing behind him like a punctuation mark, final and cold. Mia's voice wavered in the silence that followed. Anthony, he interrupted, his tone weary but firm. We're done talking for tonight. The words didn't just end their conversation, they marked the beginning of an unknown path, one lined with fractured trust and painful choices yet to come. The closing of the door reverberated through the house, leaving behind a hollow silence that seemed to echo in every corner. Anthony stared at it for a moment longer, as if expecting Sam to turn back, to reopen it and offer some explanation that would make sense of the chaos. But the silence held, deep and absolute. Mia shifted on her feet, the weight of the moment settling over her like a shroud. The look in Anthony's eyes, distant and unreadable, pierced through her. She opened her mouth to speak, to grasp at the frayed edges of whatever remained between them, but words failed her. The kitchen, once warm with memories of late-night snacks and whispered conversations, felt vast and empty. Anthony walked to the window, his back to Mia, and looked out into the darkness. The streetlights outside cast a faint, sterile glow on the pavement, indifferent to the turmoil within. He placed his palms flat against the counter, the cold granite grounding him, keeping him from being swept away by the tide of hurt and betrayal that threatened to pull him under. Was he here? He asked suddenly, the question abrupt, slicing through the silence. Mia's breath caught in her throat, the implications settling like lead in her stomach. No, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Never here. I couldn't. Anthony's jaw tightened. He didn't turn around, didn't look at her. The room seemed to shrink, the distance between them insurmountable, despite the few feet of space. The truth, even parsed out in fragments, felt suffocating. Why? The question wasn't shouted or laced with fury. It was softer, threaded with an exhaustion that made it even more poignant. He wanted to understand the crack that had formed between them, the moment it had widened into an abyss. Mia wrapped her arms around herself, seeking warmth that wasn't there. I don't know, she admitted, tears blurring her vision. I was lost. Lonely. She stopped, realizing how hollow the words sounded even to her. How could they justify the damage done? I was weak. Anthony exhaled sharply, finally turning to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed, but no tears fell. The betrayal was etched into every line of his face, a map of pain that Mia wanted to erase but knew she couldn't. Would you know what hurts the most? He said, his voice steady but raw. It's not just that you did this, but that I didn't see it. I trusted you so completely that I never even looked for signs. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to dislodge the disbelief that still clung to him. Mia's tears fell freely now, silent streaks that cut paths down her cheeks. I don't know how to make this right, Anthony. I don't even know if I can. He didn't reply immediately, the weight of her admission pressing down on them both. The moments ticked by, punctuated by the ticking of the kitchen clock and the low hum of the refrigerator. Finally he spoke, each word feeling like a final stone placed on a grave. Some things don't get fixed, Mia. Some things break and stay broken. The truth of his words settled into the silence, thick and immovable. They stood there, two people who once shared everything, now staring into the distance of what they had lost, wondering what fragments of themselves would be left to carry forward. The minutes stretched into an eternity, the house cloaked in a silence that seemed to expand and consume everything within its walls. Anthony leaned back against the counter, the weight of the night pressing down on him, compressing the air until it felt almost impossible to breathe. He glanced at the phone, lying on the table like an artifact from another life, its screen dark and silent now, yet still charged with the evidence that had unraveled everything. Mia stood across from him, a shadow of the woman she had been, eyes rimmed red, cheeks flushed, the realization of what she had lost starting to settle in. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the edge of the table, searching for stability in a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. "I never wanted this, Anthony," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Each word trembled with remorse, reaching out like a bridge over the chasm between them. "I thought somewhere along the way I thought I could stop, that it didn't have to change us." Anthony's eyes, tired and guarded, met hers. "But it did," he said simply. There was no accusation, just a statement of fact. It was a truth so plain and brutal that it needed no embellishment. The trust they'd built over years was gone, swept away not just by her actions, but by the knowledge that she had chosen deceit over honesty time and time again. He turned his gaze to the window again, watching as a lone car passed by on the street outside, its headlights cutting a swath of light that illuminated the kitchen for just a moment before darkness reclaimed it. It felt symbolic, a brief glimpse of clarity swallowed once more by uncertainty. "I don't know where we go from here," Mia admitted, her voice breaking, "or if there's even a place to go." The air between them felt brittle, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment they were in. Anthony's silence was answer enough. He pushed himself off the counter and took a few steps, pacing the kitchen in a slow, measured way. The memories of their life together rose up, unbidden laughter over Sunday breakfast, quiet evenings on the porch, whispered dreams shared when sleep wouldn't come. Each one felt distant now, unreachable. "Maybe there isn't," he finally said, more to himself than to her. "Maybe what's left is just moving forward separately." The finality in his voice struck deep, making Mia's breath hitch. The words hung in the air, drawing sharp lines between them. The kitchen that had been a space for shared moments now felt like neutral territory, an impersonal stage for a scene that neither of them had wanted to play. Mia's tears slowed, leaving tracks that glistened in the dim light, a testament to regrets that had come too late. "Anthony?" As she stopped, the words crumbling in her throat. What could she say? That she wished things were different, that she still loved him. None of it would matter now. The damage was already done, etched into the silence they shared. Anthony looked at her, eyes softening for a heartbeat before the mask of composure slipped back into place. "I think we need space. Time to figure out what this means, or if there's anything left worth trying to save." His voice was steadier now, more resigned than angry. It was the voice of a man who had seen the worst and survived, but not without scars. Mia nodded, the motion jerky, as if her body were responding on instinct alone. The room felt colder as the realization settled in. The life they had built was no longer a certainty but a question without an easy answer. She could almost hear the sound of it, like something cracking just beneath the surface. Anthony walked past her, his footsteps echoing through the house as he made his way to the stairs. He paused at the bottom, one hand resting on the banister. For a moment he turned, eyes searching hers one last time, as if trying to find some remnant of the love they had shared. "Good night, Mia," he said, the words simple, yet weighted with a finality that left no room for argument. "Good night," she replied, her voice a whisper swallowed by the silence that followed. Anthony disappeared up the stairs, and the creak of each step felt like a closing chapter. Mia stood in the kitchen, alone, the faint glow of the cracked cup on the table catching her eye. It was just a cup, she reminded herself, but it had become so much more a symbol of something once whole, now split down the middle. The night deepened and the house settled around them, the sounds of the world outside moving on as if nothing had changed. But inside, the echoes of what had been spoken and what remained unsaid lingered like shadows, haunting and irreversible.